President of Chile, Michelle Bachelet, mentioned the short-term bias as one of the biggest problems of Chilean politics. This was actually one of the things that she highlighted. Well, this book, which is about long problems, right, helps us to think about this problem. Therefore, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Professor Thomas Hale, whose scholarly work meticulously examines the governance of transnational issues with a focus on how political institutions adapt and respond to the multifaceted challenges brought about by globalization. His research ambitiously bridges the gap in our understanding of environmental, economic, and health interdependencies across global landscapes. In addition, he co-leads the Net Zero Tracker webpage. You can Google it. It's a very useful webpage, which tracks the advancement that both nations and big companies are making towards net zero targets. Finally, Professor Hale earned his PhD in politics from Princeton University and is currently a professor of public policy at Oxford University. Also, we have as a discussant Cristobal Bellolio, someone who we know very well. He has a PhD in political philosophy from University College London. He studies normative political theory with a focus on the liberal tradition. And his latest research analyzes the interaction between democracy, science, and populism. That also makes it a very good fit for discussing this book, which, by the way, we have it on the university library if you want to read it. So with a sticker, by the way, for our special seminar series. So Thomas, you have out between 30 and 40 minutes. Then Cristobal will discuss in around 10 minutes, and then we'll open the conversation, okay?
Wonderful. Thank you, Bernardo, so much for that kind introduction, and thank you all for joining today. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you. I'm delighted that President Bachelet had that insight into Chilean politics. I think it's probably something that many people, many presidents, many citizens around the world reflect on in their own politics, and really one of the inspirations I had to write this book. So let me share with you an overview of the arguments. I'm going to be pretty short if I can, so we can have more time for conversation, but really happy to dig into more detail as we go forward. So let me first start with a little bit of a motivation. Think about the problem of climate change, which is something I work on a lot in my own research, but also I think something that we think about a lot as citizens. This is a picture called Dark Satanic Mills, which you may know comes from a line from an English poet from the start of the Industrial Revolution, about 250 years ago. And it's just striking if you think about the time scale on which this problem of climate change, which we now think about so often today, has evolved. That carbon that was released in the first factories of the Industrial Revolution is still most of it up in the atmosphere today, part of the huge accumulation of carbon that's driving the warming of the planet. And that carbon will continue to remain for centuries to come. And if you think about what that carbon has seen as it's been looking down on us humans over the past 250 years, and our politics especially, which is my area of research, think of how much change that carbon has seen. It's been floating up there, kind of slowly getting absorbed back into the natural systems. But we've seen, revolutions, we've seen democracy, we've seen huge world wars, we've seen fundamental transformations in how governments operate. And so it'd be surprising if this big centuries, millennium-long problem like climate change saw politics as a constant across that time. I think that's an inspiration for why we should think about our political approach, our institutions, but also our political science, our analysis of politics as somehow locked in this current moment we live in. Actually, the problem of climate change forces us, I think, to take a longer-term view, and that's what I try to do in this book. And we know also that carbon that's going to be up there for many centuries to come, much of which we're putting in there today and in the years to come, is going to be affecting the world that our children, their children and their children will live in. And that's something that I think is also morally striking to most people. No matter what political viewpoint you come from, that's something that actually is a huge amount of consensus on ethically, and therefore a real challenge to our politics to do better on thinking about these longer term challenges. What I try to do in the book is answer three questions. I try to think about why these long-term challenges are hard to govern, what the political economy of long-term problems is, how nonetheless governments can and do seek to govern them, and then third, why social scientists sometimes don't always analyze them as effectively as we might, and what better social science we could apply to this sort of temporal challenge. I'm not going to talk about that today, that third question, because it's maybe a more detailed one, but happy to talk about it in Q&A. But today I wanted to speak to these first two questions, really to get across 4 points if I can. First, what are long problems? What do I mean by this title of the book? 2, what are their governance challenges? 3, what solutions are possible? And 4, what are the implications for climate change in particular? And for those of you who work a lot on climate change, I'd be really interested in your assessment of that fourth question in particular. But let me start with the most obvious one, which is what are long problems? Why this term? So in the book, I define long problems as those whose causes and effects span more than one human generation. And the climate change example I started with is a clear example of this, where the causes of climate change, emissions we put into the atmosphere, stay out there for a very long time. Their effects go on for not just the moment they go up there, but for decades, centuries, millennium to come. And then the impacts of climate change, a warming world onto, say, the natural system, for example, bleaching coral reefs or desertification, or the transition of the Amazon rainforest from a jungle into a savanna, all of those kinds of effects are very long-term in how long they last. So there's a lot of time dimension to this kind of problem. But of course, there are many other problems that have a long gap between cause and effect as well. Another example you can think of is urban planning or infrastructure, where building a city in a certain way can have huge effects on, say, social mobility or economic development, or relations between different communities of people long into the future. Similar with infrastructure projects, which can last a long time. Another one that I think is really pressing for many countries around the world today is around how we provide for social welfare for old people, pensions. Pension systems were set up in a world where most economies which were setting them up had a very different demographic profile and age structure than they do now. And they were set up in a way where political incentives are often to protect the status quo as opposed to think about the long-term stability of those systems. And now those two things are coming into a real collision course for many countries' social welfare systems. So I focus a lot on climate change in the book, but I'm hopeful that the lessons from climate change around governing long problems will also apply to a wider category of problems that we solve, that we face. But the definition is really quite simple. It's about the time between cause and effect of problems. I think it's possible that we have more long problems today than we did in the past. This is not a claim I would stand strongly behind, but I think certainly in the environmental realm, which is a big area of my research, we have a new set of challenges where, because human development has proceeded so far, because our technology has become more sophisticated, we're able to actually affect the planetary scale systems in a different way than humans were able to do so in the past. And that naturally puts human systems in conflict, or at least in tension, with planetary systems like the carbon cycle, or indeed many of the other planetary systems that we're up against, which just naturally have this longer time frame. So that's one reason. But the development of technology also allows us to see these problems in a different kind of way. So the fact that we can model the effect of climate change long into the future, that we can understand the greenhouse effect as accumulation of greenhouse gases over centuries, all these things are putting long problems more into the moment today than they are in the past, although I'm sure we've had plenty of long problems in history as well. But that's the first point I want to cover, is what are long problems, the simplest one. Second, though, and this is the main core argument of the book, is why are they hard to govern? And as President Bachelet said, it's kind of obvious to us in some ways that they are. But let me just underscore that point by pointing to the international efforts to address climate change over the past few decades. So the first big international meeting on climate governance was the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. And this is a picture of the world leaders who were gathered there. And notice they're almost all of them male, and maybe not a bit of a blast from the past to look at. But the point is that when they were gathered there in Rio in 1992, they made a promise in international law to prevent dangerous changes in the Earth's climate. That was in the text of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And since that time, they've met again and again and again to be able to try to deliver on that promise. And over those 3 decades or so, there's been increasingly dire warnings from the scientific community saying that if we don't act on this, it's going to be hugely consequential. And it's been pretty clear for at least 25 years that this is something where action in the present is needed to secure a better outcome in the future. And the costs of not acting are much, much higher than the cost of acting if we get this right. And yet still, of course, we've seen a lot of frustration come from these conferences of the parties or COPs. And actually next year, the COP will be back in Brazil and at a key moment where the countries are expected to present their second pledges under the Paris Agreement, the second ratchet of these nationally determined contributions that they have to make, and a really critical moment to see if this mechanism we set up can actually deliver. So, I think the governance of climate change is a case par excellence of not being able to act effectively on long problems. And so it seems kind of obvious this is the case. But we need to do better than that as social scientists and as policymakers than just sort of saying, oh yeah, it's obviously hard to do it because we have a short-term bias. We need to, I think, understand in more detail the political economy of these problems, because in that analysis, we gain new insights into what kinds of solutions are going to be effective and how and under what conditions those solutions might be effective. And so what I try to do in the book is to draw mostly on political economy, which is my own field, but also taking some cues from other fields that have been more attuned to this temporal problem for a longer time than my own field, to try to organize some thinking on that into some theoretically coherent thoughts. And there are 3 mechanisms I'd like to share with you today. The first I call shadow interests. So in politics, many problems are solved, quote unquote, solved or otherwise addressed because people who are negatively affected by a problem respond and force change to resolve that problem. This is, something you see very clearly in classic political economy works like, Olson and others. But if you look at issue after issue, it's often things where there's a clear harm on a group that then promotes action. People don't often mobilize to secure sort of disparate gains. They mobilize often to respond to concentrated costs. However, if effects are in the future, as by definition they are for long problems, then those people don't yet exist. They are not here. They can't advocate for their interests because they don't exist. They have no agency. And so we can only think of them as shadow interests, kind of as these sort of platonic, imagine Plato's cave. You can think about these are future people who we can kind of maybe guess at their interests. We can think about what they might be. Maybe we'd be sympathetic to them in some way, but they're not forces in politics. And so they're even less powerful than, say, people who lack political rights or who are otherwise oppressed in some way, but still have agency to act. They have no agency, and that sort of drains one of the most necessary ingredients for political action from long problems and makes it much harder to get progress on them. So that's one really big set of challenges. The second barrier I would point to, I call institutional lag. And this, again, is nothing more than a sort of natural effect of a long gap between cause and effect of problems. So obviously institutions, by which I mean laws, policies, organizations, any kind of human-created system, have to be durable in order to have an effect. If you have a law that's going to change tomorrow and the next day, then it's not going to have much power to drive behavior. But problems, of course, change over time, and indeed they change more as you have more time on average. So if you have institutions that are naturally and by design sticky, and problems that have to inevitably change as time goes on, you might get more and more of a gap between institutions and problems as time goes forward. And again, we see this very clearly in the UN climate change negotiations, where some of the ways we set up institutions in 1992, when those mostly men were sitting together in Rio and coming up with the system, don't really work well today. To my mind, the biggest one of those is how the UN system focuses first on prevention of the climate problem. It's really set up to drive mitigation. But over time, as we've been less successful on prevention, people who have been experiencing more of the effects of climate change have said, hey, what about us? And so adaptation, in other words, responding to the effects of climate change, has now become a really critical area of climate action. But it took a long time, and still not all the way there, for the UN system to absorb this new mandate on adaptation and to actually build processes that are seeking to advance action on adaptation. And I think we're only just getting there now, about 25 years too late. A new issue has emerged onto the UN's agenda around dealing not just with preventing climate change through mitigation, responding to its impacts through adaptation, but actually how do we deal with the damage and the loss that climate change is already affecting us today, the so-called loss and damage issue. And this is really difficult for the UN to now adapt to this other aspect of the problem that's emerged as time has gone on, because it's so locked into the way of solving the problem it came to started with at the beginning. And so this institutional lag is really undermining our ability to deal with a problem that evolves as we go on and as things change. The final barrier I point us to in the book is called the early action paradox, which again comes from the definition of long problems where action causes being way before effects. And with that kind of problem, you of course need to act before those effects are known or if they're salient. And so you have to act sort of as this person is doing before you know what the outcome is going to be. And as you can see, this person falling off a building has a pretty smiley face. He's quite happy because he's thinking, oh, so far so good. Nothing bad's come up yet. And obviously, if you could see a bit further forward in time, you might have a different way of approaching that issue. Saliency is one of the great drivers of politics. Certainty is one of the great drivers of politics. When you have uncertainty and you have low salience, it really changes the ability of political actors to make effective progress on an issue. And I think for an issue like climate change, where there's huge distributional consequences, winners and losers from different policies, this creates makes it very, very difficult for those who wish to see more climate action to take action that can overcome the opposition and indeed the obstruction of those who wish to see less action on climate change. And here I mean specifically carbon-intensive industries, fossil fuel industries, those who really benefit economically from the status quo. As I said before, those are the ones who are often, it's often the ones who are hurt by policy, mobilized most energetically against it. And when you have low salience and high uncertainty, that really empowers obstructionism. So it makes it extremely difficult for an entrepreneur, a political entrepreneur, to take forward climate action when they have to speak to effects that are less known and less salient. So those three problems rooted in political economy analysis add up to something quite challenging. These are problems that are not going to be easy politically. Future people can't act on what affects them because they don't exist yet. Problems change, but institutions are sticky, and we need to act before effects are known or salient. So we're left with muddling through. That's the problem. That's the difficulty. That's the barrier. But I think the most important message I have in the book, and the one I really try to focus on in the chapters, is the third point I want to make, which is that we can govern these problems. And actually, we have many examples where governments are taking action on long problems and having effects, having success. And as with any sort of complex area of policy, there's not kind of one silver bullet. There's not one way of doing this. It's more like, here's different families of approaches that we see acting on. What I try to do in the book is to organize those different solutions of different kinds into some buckets, into a crude taxonomy that corresponds to these different problems, and to try to analyze how and under what conditions can they be more or less effective. So let me just quickly summarize a few of these tools and then give you a few examples, which I think help illustrate the point I'm trying to make. So first, how can we address something like the shadow interest problem? Well, there's lots of different ways we see. It can be, for example, giving a voice to future generations in governance systems. Here in the UK, in Wales specifically, there's a function of government, a governmental actor called the Commissioner for Future Generations, whose job it is to opine on policy and to say, is this policy beneficial or not beneficial for future generations? We see that also in places like as diverse as Hungary and Israel and then in other kinds of committees in Finland, in Kenya, and other places. So it's about trying to articulate, institutionalize a bit more of a voice. Stronger than that, we see in other places governments giving power to trustee institutions. Trustees are agents who don't have to do what you say, who are kind of arm's length from you, like a central bank or a court. And in many places, we see these existing trustee institutions like central banks and courts taking on a longer term perspective and using that as a way to overcome the short-term pressures that other parts of the political system generate. And we also see some emerging examples, and I'll speak more about this, of where countries are creating new trustee institutions that help them to address climate change in particular. A final family of solutions for the problem of shadow interests is around addressing time horizons that political actors have. So of course, we have a system where many economic actors are responding to short-term quarterly earnings reports and things like that. There are interventions that can be made to change how value is created in the economy. Those are more ambitious, but even something quite simple, like getting people, individual citizens, into different modes of decision-making has been shown to extend their time horizons. When people are in a citizens' assembly, for example, meeting with their fellow colleagues in a more holistic way, taking time out from the usual rough and tumble, tooth and nail combat of politics, to actually think about what we want as a community, you find those people tend to become both more other regarding, there's a lot more research on that, but also tend to think more about the future, which is a really interesting cognitive shift you get from different institutional settings. So several categories of solutions that we see emerging around the world there. On the institutional lab question, we also have a number of families of tools that are in practice around the world. Goal setting is a big one. Governments often set goals, sometimes we set goals internationally, like sustainable development goals, or historically things like eliminating smallpox or other diseases. That's an important way to create durability over time. But at the same time, we need to pair that durability with ways of increasing the ability of institutions to update. So you have to have this kind of delicate balance between updating and durability. And so different ways of having reflexive governance include, for example, sunset clauses or review clauses. When a new law is passed, you can have a provision that says, we will review this in 5 years, we'll review this in 10 years. And actually it's striking how many, it seems like a very basic idea, but how many of our current political problems, and I'll just give one example from here in the UK, but it's very common around the world, planning rules, like rules on which parts of land can be used for what kind of infrastructure development, tend to never have sunset clauses. So a kind of way of building houses, say it has to be, this kind of size of house and this kind of size of plot for this number of people, tend to be locked into time. And then we end up with a system where only people who live there, only the people who have that kind of living situation are the ones who live there. Of course, they want to support the status quo because that's what they're invested in, literally. And then we can never change those kind of planning rules. And so we have this huge housing crisis around the world because we have this lock-in of a fundamentally dysfunctional system. If we just said we're going to change that over time and have a system we're doing that, we would have, I think, it'd avoided a lot of those problems. Final column on the right, this idea of the early action paradox, a number of family solutions there as well. We have ways of making the future more known and more salient. And that can be something very simple, like a regulatory impact assessment, where we don't just consider what the effect of a policy will be, but also think about what the effect of policy will be on its on the target it's trying to address, but also other areas, for example, the environment. That's a very common method around the world. We have more interesting tools like trying to seed innovations through experimentalism that can then find paths toward more effective solutions that then reduce uncertainty over time. We've seen that, for example, in the realm of new technology development, renewable energy, or other electric vehicles or batteries or others, where governments don't say we're going to ban conventional energy tomorrow, but we're going to start to innovate and experiment with some of these technologies and see if we can build them to a point where they kind of tip over and become competitive or even outcompete the incumbent technology. And we also have ways of trying to erode this obstructionist element I was thinking about through catalytic tools like we saw in the Paris Agreement. I can talk more about that in a second. But so that's, the point I try to make in the book is that there's no silver bullet here. These are about families of solutions, and what we want to try to do is transform our governance systems to be much more long-term oriented but in a way that's going to be appropriate and contextualized and make sense in the political economy of a given context. So it's not like here a recipe for here's the 5 policies the government must do to overcome the problem of long problems. It's rather here's a wide range of tools, and governments should begin to ask themselves, activists should ask themselves, citizens should ask themselves, how do we make our systems more long-term by drawing on the right mix of these? Let me just illustrate a few of them with some more specific cases, because I think it's a little bit hard to see in the abstract, and zooming in will be helpful. And let me speak about 2 that I find kind of exciting, one in the trusteeship category and one in the catalyst category. So trustee institutions, as I said before, are all about finding ways to make decisions that we insulate decision makers from short-term concerns in some way by tying their hands. And we use this, technology, if you put it that way, it's governance technology all the time in for example, central banks or in courts or other tools. But one of the interesting innovations in the climate space, I think, is something called the California Air Resources Board. I think, Bernardo, you, if I remember correctly, were at Stanford, so you maybe have even come across CARB in your time there. But it's a really interesting regulatory body, which I don't think has many cognates around the world. It's created in the 60s, actually, by then Governor Ronald Reagan, and it was created to solve the problem of smog, where too many cars in California were putting out too much pollution and people were having trouble breathing. But it was given this very powerful mandate to basically clean up California's air. And over time, it basically institutionalized itself as essentially a very independent, highly autonomous regulatory agency that was given high-level goals from politicians, from the legislature, from the governor, but then given huge scope to implement them. And so California, which is one of the jurisdictions in the world which has some of the most ambitious climate policies, has used this model to great success. When California passed its net zero legislation, it was a very short document. I think, if I remember correctly, something like 4 pages long. And it gave a lot of scope to assigning so it gave the goal to the California Air Resources Board, CARB, but it said, CARB, you figure out how to get there, and you adjust as we need to go along the way to make sure we're meeting our targets. And so it's basically a way to institutionalize some of the key decisions around distributional problems or other things in a governance model, which avoids some of the short-term pressures that legislatures face. Now, of course, this is not 100% of a trustee. It's not California Resources Board. It's maybe like 1 or 2 notches less independent than a central bank, but it's something that I think is quite innovative in the climate space. And we could probably imagine this model expanding further. You might be asking now at this point, okay, but is this good for democracy? And I know, Cristobal, this is your area, so I'm looking forward to your comments on this dimension. I think it's very consistent with many normative views of democracy to have delegation to trusteeship institutions. We have courts, we have central banks, we have many such things in our repertoire. And I would argue that the rationale for doing this kind of delegation increases in proportion to problem length. That when we have a long-term policy goal, actually having these more arm's length institutions is a good way to deliver that objective in a way that serves society's needs and interests, just as we do for other policy areas. So I think this is a really interesting area. But I want to make sure I'm not coming across here as some sort of person saying that, less democracy, more technocracy is the answer to long-term problems. I don't think that's right at all. And so I would expect any kind of robust long-term governance system to not just involve more technocracy, but to involve more participation as a necessary countermeasure and complement to that kind of technocracy. That's why in the book I talk a lot about climate assemblies as a way to get citizens engaged in a more participatory form of governance that has a long-term orientation as well. So it's not about just giving decisions to so-called technocrats. It's about combining, complementing standard run-of-the-mill representative democracy with these more technocratic trustee institutions on one hand, but also, and critically important, the more participatory citizen-oriented tools on the other hand. Putting those two together, I think, is what we need, not having one or the other. The second example I wanted to point to is this idea of catalyst. What is a catalyst? What do I mean by a catalytic institution? And here I want to zoom out to back to the international level. so that picture I showed you of the folks in Rio in 1992, the governance technology they set up there was what I would call a sort of command and control style international treaty, which is basically following the model that all previous environmental treaties have used to address these kind of commons problems. Essentially saying we're going to have a common global deal, which is going to say you can emit this much, you can emit that much, we'll negotiate those targets, and then we'll have some kind of system to monitor whether you're doing that or not. And if you don't do it, there'll be some kind of enforcement, in this case, a very weak level of enforcement to try to persuade you to do what you said you would do. And that's kind of the recipe for solving global climate action problems. Many treaties have that structure. But in 2015, where this picture was taken in Paris, countries actually switched that model because it wasn't working after 21 COPs. They decided to try a different approach. And what they did was create a more, what I call a catalytic system, where countries don't negotiate a kind of deal, a global deal on what each country has to do. Rather, each country says for itself what it's going to do in these nationally determined contributions, these pledges, and they put those forward, but they have to update them every 5 years. And so there's a dynamic element to it. And it's trying to basically solve the collective action problem, not through the sort of global deal model, but rather solve the collective action problem through getting a critical mass of action going that can then beget further action going forward. So a kind of threshold solution as opposed to a global deal solution. I think from a theoretical standpoint, it's an equally valid the theory, the math works out in the sense that you can solve a collective action problem that way under certain conditions. And the question is whether it's working in practice. And I think my assessment is that it's working better than the global deal model. So the global deal model resulted in the Kyoto Protocol, 1997 treaty, which had a small, very incremental step forward on emissions reductions, which quickly fell aside as the United States, which was the largest emitter at the time, pulled out of the treaty. And a few others basically never really did any meaningful action under it. But in Paris, we've had so far one test of this so-called ratchet mechanism, this idea that you update over time and catalyze action through action. And it's a complicated graph, but just to summarize very briefly, the middle line here shows you in 2015 where we stood on both the pledges countries have made, that's the blue line. The policies they actually have put in place, that's the blue line. And then the pledges they've made, which is the gray line. And obviously the pledges don't quite get as far as, the policies don't get as far as the pledges. So there's a big gap between what countries say they're going to do and what they're actually doing. But the important point to our discussion today that you get from this graph is that actually the temperature we expect to see in this temperature rise we expect in the century has gone down a lot from where it was in Paris, right? So Paris has not put us on to as far as we need to go to, but it's been a big ratchet down of what we were on track to achieve as a climate change in 2015, where we are today because of this, I would argue in large part because of this catalytic model, or maybe have reduced the pathway by about 1 degree in terms of implemented policies, and maybe something even closer to 1.5 degrees according to the pledges countries have made. Obviously, we have more ratcheting we need to do, and that's where the COP in Brazil next year is so important. That's going to be a second opportunity for countries to ratchet up their targets. But this catalytic mechanism gives us at least a way to work on the collective action problem that I would argue is more effective than the previous global deal model, which just wasn't incentive compatible with where countries were politically on the issue. So 2 examples of this big family of solutions around trustee institutions with CARB and then the Paris Agreement as a catalytic model. Let me then conclude by saying where this all leaves us for climate change. As I was saying before, there's no silver bullet here, but I think we often have a problem in climate politics where people say, if there's just a bit more political will, then we could have the policies we need. I think we know exactly what the policies we need are. There's many binders of PDFs full of good policies you can get from any NGO or from the World Bank or from the UN or other sources. And we have a structural deficit in political will because we haven't created political institutions that generate political will in response to long problems for the 3 reasons I said, because we have an institutional lag problem, because we have shadow interest, because we have an early action paradox. And so what we need to do for to solve climate change, or indeed for any other long problem, is to adjust our political institutions to be more responsive to these kinds of long-term challenges. And for climate, that can mean, for example, Others saying putting in more informational tools. Social cost of carbon is a nice economic tool, for example, and others to help make the reality of climate change more salient and certain in near-term decisions. You have more independent trustees, for example. If we have central banks that set the price of money, why don't we have central banks that set the price of carbon? There's no reason why we couldn't apply that same technology to this set of challenges. Again, as I said before, it's about participation as well. Citizen juries can be brought in to help give people longer-term perspectives and to help ensure representation of future generations alongside climate assemblies. You can have more long-term goals. We've actually done a pretty good job of goal setting, I would say, in the climate change space. For many countries now have long-term goals, but we can improve them through creating that balance between updating and durability right, and other ways to build this out as well. I think if we do all of this, we'll end up in a system where actually our governance tools look quite different. If we do it for climate change, we might actually be able to apply these tools for other long problems as well. And I think that'd be a very good outcome. There's no reason why the political institutions we have today are the ones we necessarily need to have tomorrow. And this kind of challenge the long problems gives us is, I think, a real invitation to rethink how democracy can be best operationalized in a world where problems don't just confront us here and now, but actually over a long period of time. Final thought, I worry that if we don't take that step and adjust our political institutions to be more effective at addressing long problems, we'll actually be forced into more short-termism by climate change. As the impacts of climate change intensify, the political pressure will really build to have more short-term protection and less long-term prevention. Just think about it. If you're a mayor of a city responding to a series of a heat wave where temperatures have been over 50 degrees Celsius for, at night for a long period of time, you're going to, of course, invest in more air conditioners or other kind of protection mechanisms, not in prevention, because that's what people need. And so you'll have to do that. And therefore, we're going to be in a world where it's much more short-term and much less long-term, and that's going to be a much worse equilibrium to end up on. So I think the choice really is: do we going to use this catalyst, this impetus from climate change or other long problems to build our institutions to become more long-term, or are they going to force us into this more reactive state where I think we're going to see a lot of deterioration? That's the big challenge in front of us. Looking forward to your questions and comments, and thank you again for your consideration.
Okay, thank you. Great. Cristóbal?
Thanks very much. Thanks, Tom. It's a great book, an exhilarating book, actually. So I want to say first that I think you're right. Our normative colleagues, political theorists, have already agreed that intergenerational justice is an important value to pursue, and political scientists should try to embody those principles in institutions. So I think that's the great contribution of your work. And I think it is, even though there's no a silver bullet, as you say, it is an overall optimistic view. It's not everything lost. If you read your book, there is some hope in the future. So I want to make just a few comments. I think you may understand why ex-presidents realize why it's so important to tackle long-term issues, because they're not as aware when they are actually ruling, because they get trapped, of course, in everyday politics. And I think that the elephant in the room, in many ways, is this question whether democracy can handle climate change. And you say, Thomas, that you think that question is a bit sort of overstated, because real authoritarianism has not proven to be any better than real democracies. So it would be interesting to think not about real authoritarianism, not about Maduro's Venezuela. We may agree that kind of authoritarianism will not work. In a certain passage, you mentioned the case of China and Singapore, but you say that they all have to account for their deeds anyway in sort of a short term. I was reviewing a rather pessimistic book, but Ross Mitiga, and he talks about that we may need authoritarian climate emergency powers. So maybe this is not a dystopian call for an eco-authoritarianism through and through, or a green Leviathan, but maybe we are not going to be vegans, or we are not going to renounce fossil fuel transport without any coercion. Maybe we need some coercion. I think that's Ros Mitiga's point. And it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on whether not a real authoritarianism as we know it, but maybe this is back the question, but a sort of ideal green authoritarianism could make this challenge work better. The second point is a conceptual point. I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right when you say that the kind of solutions that you're asking for, trustees and so are entirely compatible with what we understand by a constitutional liberal democracy. I think you're right about that. But I think that the tricky concept here is the liberal democracy, because in our liberal democracies, we are used to checks and balances. In a liberal democracy, we think that it is a good thing to take out of the contingent majority some very sensible issues, as you know, monetary policies, and you talk about courts, central banks, international treaties, commissions for the future. All this, let's say, for the sake of the argument, non-elected technocratic bodies, in a way, in populist times, are seen as elites taking from the people decisions that should be in the hands of the people. I mean, the Brexit was all about that, take back control from Brussels. So I wonder whether, so agreeing that your argument is entirely compatible with a liberal democratic order, because the liberal component is the one that sort of constrained democratic power, and instead of just pure popular sovereignty. I wonder whether this sort of populist climate, which some people say it is democratic but not liberal, some people talk about illiberal democracy, as you know. So I wonder this kind of illiberal democracy will be compatible with your argument. And there's another definition of populism. I'm thinking about, for example, Nadia Urbinati's work. And for Urbinati, there's no such thing as liberal democracy. That's sort of a redundancy, because democracy is already liberal. So you cannot talk about a liberal, an illiberal democracy. But she thinks that populism is essentially presentist. It's impatient. It wants to get things. I mean, should be done in the here and now. So democracy, in that account, should account for the here and now. So I was thinking about the yellow vests, for example, in France. I'm not saying that the yellow vests are climate denialists. Some of them are climate denialists, but a sizable portion of them, they just want to they don't want to pay the bill for the feast that, in their view, the green elites that they're imposing their top-down agenda, their green agenda, are sort of obstaculizing the satisfaction of their present needs. So I wonder whether it is possible in this climate, in this populist climate, that the end of the month sort of priorities are compatible with the end of the world priorities. And I think in a populist context, people say, you know what? The end of the month is much more important than the end of the world, because in the long run, see, Keynes used to say, we're all dead. And a final point, and I think just to finish the previous point, and I think that some populist thinkers will say to you, you know what? Insulation can work for your argument, but insulation is not entirely democratic. Tying our hands may work for your argument, but tying our hands is not entirely democratic in a very minimalistic sense, not in a liberal democratic sense. So that's my point. And then the final point that I want to make is that I think you're right. We should, in order to tackle the early action problem, we should make these problems known and salient. So I've been doing some research recently on climate denialism, and most of my colleagues blame the fossil fuel industry. And in some passage, you say, you know what, this might be true. So there's some economic interest. There are sort of growing some doubt among the wider population. So either, although 99% of scientists agree that there is a climate crisis caused by humanity, the wider public is not entirely in the same page. There are some countries in which it's 50-50 or 60-40, and the fossil fuel industry is always to be blamed because of this sort of lobby campaigning, media campaigning, and so and so. So I wonder whether, in order to make this crisis, this emergence, some media now label it like The Guardian, in order to make this climate emergence known and salient, we should do something about denialist speech. So some of my colleagues, I'm thinking about Catriona Macchino, for example, say that we may have good reason not to tolerate as a freedom of speech, not to tolerate climate speech. But even if we try to fight back against the fossil fuel industry, we may have other ideological routes for climate denial. Libertarians, even populists who are suspicious, who are distrustful about scientists because scientists are elites, or Davos, or Soros, or Bill Gates, all these sort of constellations of elites in the mind of the plebeian majorities. So I wonder whether would you say that we should do more in order to make these problems known and salient by putting not just more future into democracy, but putting more science into democracy without becoming a technocracy? How can we how we can make more weighty scientific inputs without becoming a technocracy? Maybe public reason, like liberal public reason, is one alternative to acknowledge that in a democracy you should be epistemically pluralist. So ancestral worldviews should be respected in the same sense as scientific sort of rationalities, but at the same time you want to say, you know what, in order to tackle this problem, we should make scientific arguments more weighty if we want to make climate emergency more known or salient for the wider population. So that's my points.
Great, Thomas. If you want, you can reply to Cristobal, and anyone can write their questions in the Q&A or send it to me directly if you want.
Great, thank you for these fantastic comments, Cristobal, and I'll be very short so I can take any further questions. But yes, I think you summarized it very well. You know, democracy definitely has short-term problems. So does every other political system in the world, and an absence of elections is not the solution to short-termism. I think there are examples of a small number of autocracies who have some good systems, but they're not about their autocraticness. That's the thing that's helping them. It's about having a planning system, for example, as in China. So it's an entirely different part of the political system that's not of course entirely different, but it's not the lack of democracy that's making China good at planning. It's about having a very strong focus on planning that's making China good at planning. And so I think there's every political system in the world can be improved by thinking about these different families of solutions that I talk about in the book. I think the point on coercion is really critical. We're not going to solve a distributional challenge like climate change with pure voluntarism, right? It will require the articulation of what the public interest is, and then the use of state power to achieve the public interest, as is any other distributional problem in the world does, right? And from taxation to whatever issue you think about. That I think my own normative position would be that must be done in accordance with the democratic process that respects rights and things. And I think there's some interesting ways to do that, which are very not just within the bounds of democracy, but also arguably normatively bad the other way, in that they give too much to the people who have caused the harm. So one solution to overcoming obstructionism from fossil fuel interests, for example, is to purchase them for the public to buy and retire and wind down fossil fuel assets. And this is places like Spain or Germany that have led to coal phase outs have basically used this approach where they buy the thing, they pay off the capital holders and the labor, the people who work in the mines, and then use. So that's a very arguably in environmental policy, we say the polluter should pay, not we should pay the polluter. But I think we see that might be a more effective solution in some ways to getting to the outcome we need to get to. On the second question on is it liberalism that I'm pushing for? I think the analysis is certainly right that populism is sort of inherently of the moment. It has a sort of short-term energy to it. I'm struck though. So I was in Kenya a few months ago. The Kenyan Senate has created a committee for future generations. It's a really interesting model where there's a part of the legislature which is meant to scrutinize government decisions for their impact on the future. And the leader of that, the senator who drove that, has been one of the government's fiercest critics. He's in the opposition party. He's a very fierce critic of the way the government has taken on debt. And as we've seen in recent weeks in Kenya, that's become a hugely populist reaction against new taxes that the government wanted to impose to pay back debt. Basically, all the hallmarks of a populist movement. And the leader of that is this guy, the senator who has been, or one of the figureheads of this movement has been the senator who's using this future community to say, like, we young Kenyans shouldn't have to pay the debt that has been accumulated by our ancestors, the incumbents, and it's destroying our future. Our country has no future if we have to have these huge taxes to pay back this international debt. So that's an example of kind of populist long-termism, if you will. So I think you're probably right that the tendency of populism is the other way around, but this could be pointing in the direction. So I'll stop there so we can get some more questions and points.
Thank you. I got some questions. Because of time, we're going to have to go really fast. So Paulo Garcia, that works, he was a former, board member of the central bank. And he talked about a book called Ministry of the Future. I don't know if you read it. And he said, what do you think about kind of like a more econ solution, which will be for example, to decrease discount rates. Everything that we evaluate as economists, when we evaluate the future, right, it's we use a discount rate parameter. How do you think about some kind of solution of decreasing that rate, maybe because of this emergency, and then increasing it later, also by funneling liquidity from central banks to big projects? That's one question. Another one that I have is, so is this not a problem of simply political cooperation now? Now political agents are constantly fighting, basically, and it's a lot of competition, and we're really lacking political cooperation. So how can we create that? And a last question is, obviously this is very centralized when we talk about the government or having a particular institution, but also what is the role of social society and civic society in general in kind of trying to generate a decentralized solution to this problem? That's all.
Thank you. So on the first set of questions, I think discount rates are indeed a useful tool. This is a way of modeling crudely what the future impact of a policy would be, and we can make different choices about that. There's a helpful approach a few governments use called the social cost of carbon, which is when you're doing a cost-benefit of analysis of a new regulation to put in a carbon price effectively that takes into account future impacts in a way that's robust to different scientific model scenarios for what climate change might look like. And this was something the United States, for example, had in the Obama administration. Trump removed it, Biden put it back. It's, I think, a very useful piece of the architecture. Central banks, I think, can do a lot more. It's extraordinary, isn't it, that we have things like central banks that have a huge impact on the economy, setting effectively big distributional questions between savers and borrowers, et cetera. And in many ways, the politics of climate change are similar. We have a kind of social outcome that's optimal. We have distributional trade-offs, and we have a long-term stability that's needed. And so I think applying that sort of approach to setting the price of carbon or other kinds of tools is valuable. CARB is one example, as mentioned. Many other countries have a kind of less of a trustee, more of an advisory body, like the UK Climate Change Committee, that provides a sort of independent thing. But I think we're moving in the direction of having more of those. And I think central banks themselves can do a huge amount more. And indeed, I would argue, have the responsibility to do so. If you're thinking about macroprudential stability as one of your mandates as a central bank, and you're not incorporating this kind of challenge across time, I think you might be missing an important part of the picture. So that's why I think a lot of central banks are getting much more involved in this. And finally, I think the political civil society piece of it is critical. It comes to the point of cooperation as well. We're not going to solve these kinds of huge transformations with pure technocracy, because you have a regulation that has something like a social cost of carbon. That's a very technocratic answer, but ultimately it has to be about what we want to achieve as a society. And things like goal setting, one of the key families of solutions, are really about people coming together to articulate a vision for what they want to be. And I find it fascinating how many communities around the world have come together in different kinds of climate assemblies to have a kind of see climate change as an opportunity to ask themselves the question, what do we want our city, our town, our country to look like in 100 years from now? I think that can be a really rejuvenating thing for democracy. Democracy is so often today compressed to a very simple act of partisan voting and competition, but actually it's much more participatory model, which the climate we see emerging sort of organically in the climate space, I think has a huge amount, is just in other areas as well. So I'm inspired by that, without hopefully being too naive about how far it can get us. Oh, Bernard, I think you might be muted.
Great. Okay, there is one more question. Do you have time to answer it? Or
yes.
Okay, it says, how do you envision the practical implementation of policies that effectively balance the immediate political pressures with the long-term goals required to address long problems like climate change, particularly in the democracies where short-term electoral cycles dominate the decision-making process? Yesterday, I heard in Nancy Pelosi in the Ezra Klein show, and she said, like, representatives are elected every 2 years. So they have the same problem, right? That when you have election, but at the same time, it might keep you close to the people. So how do you look at those kind of election cycle problems?
Yeah, so I think if you have a system that's only about having accountability moments like elections or in authoritarian systems, other kinds of accountability tools in every short period of time, then that is, of course, a driver for short-termism. That's exactly why political systems need to have this wider family of solutions to counterbalance that tendency through trustee institutions, through participatory assemblies, through all these other things that help to complement that. And I think the problem with many of our democracies today is that they don't have those complementary features. They just have this kind of basic representative democracy tools, and that does hinder it. But a lot of research has shown, for example, that when you have countries which have parties that last over a longer period of time, those countries tend to make more long-term investments in, for example, science and technology development, basic childhood education, climate things, so things that have a longer-term payoff. And the theory there is, of course, that the people might come and go, but if the parties taking some kind of responsibility, they have a reputation that is at risk for a longer period of time. So I think that's a great example of showing that yes, elections do have this effect. I don't think we need elections, definitely, but it's about these other parts of the system of how you complement them and make them more effective at managing the trade-off between the here and the present and the future.
Great. Well, thank you. This was very interesting. I invite people again in the university if they want to see the books. They can buy it, alternative number 1, or they also can get it in the library. So thank you, Thomas. This was great. Thank you, Cristobal. We're going to upload this webinar and I will send you the link. Okay.
Thanks very much, Thomas. Very interesting.
Bye.
Thank you.